right, I now call the July 18th, 2023 special meeting of the City Council to order. Ms. Hoffman, if you can take roll call, please.
Ms. Nicely?
Present.
Mr. Cahill?
Present.
Ms. Kyle?
Here.
Mr. Skidmore?
Here.
Mr. Hermes?
Here.
Ms. Skidmore? Here. Ms. Reckers?
Here.
Ms. Jasper Lucas?
Here.
Ms. Wilson?
Here.
All right, wonderful, thank you. All right, Mr. Gatlin, legislation.
So an ordinance amending Section 96 of the Erlanger Code of Ordinances and ordinance numbers 1603, 2153, 2302, and 2343 related to park regulations. What is underlined portions are what is added. This portion stricken are to be removed. This is simplifying the overall Section 96, which deals with all of the parks. It's frankly reducing quite a few sections. It also is creating adding in the phone number to call to reserve the shelter areas, and then we are adding Section 9628, organized athletic teams, that no athletic team shall practice or compete on any field or at any Erlanger park without receiving a permit by the City of Erlanger, and no athletic team shall receive a permit in any Erlanger park that does not have the required field or facilities for that specific park. This is the second reading.
Okay, do I entertain a motion that we adopt as presented?
I don't have a question, but I want to make a comment before I vote. I think we need to pass this ordinance because this group of kids, they were practicing in the park, and a lot of people weren't even aware that they were there until one day there was a clash with a schedule, and I think we owe it to them to at least try. You know, this way, if we're signing out the park or making reservations, I think that's a good compromise and see how it goes. If we have problems, then we don't give them a permit anymore. But this group of kids deserves a break, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to make Erlanger a friendship city. So I just wanted to say that because people were wondering why you vote a certain way. Well, that's why.
I appreciate that, Ms. Kyle. Thank you. Are you making a motion, Ms. Jasper Lucas?
I was going to make a motion, but I don't know, are we doing our comments now or are we doing them after?
We can make a motion and then to make a motion and then second, Ms. Reckers. Okay, discussion, Ms. Jasper Lucas.
Thank you. I'm encouraging my fellow council members to vote yes on the parks ordinance. We've been working on revising this ordinance for almost a year and have had lengthy discussion and debate about it. We have listened to those with all kinds of opinions on this. I know many of you have attended the Parks Task Force meetings in the past few months and have had input on the revised park permit application that has been developed. I truly believe, like Vicki said, that we have taken concerns from all residents and taken them into consideration with the revised ordinance and application, and the perceived issues will be avoided. And if they aren't, then we can make changes. We are not opening a Pandora's box. We are simply opening up the opportunity for more to enjoy our parks that all of our taxpayers fund. Imagine if the residents on Crescent Avenue said they didn't like Depot Park being used for depot days in the summer because it was their park to be used only how they wanted. Hundreds of kids and adults may not have the opportunity to interact with first responders, learn about safety, get their car seats checked, learn about topics like geology, health and fitness, and agriculture, enjoy entertainment from a puppet show, and receive lunch twice a week. I frequently hear adults comment that kids need to get outside more and stop sitting inside playing video games. Here's our opportunity to encourage that. I've said this before, and I'll say it forever to anyone who will listen. We have a mental health crisis among kids, and we have to do absolutely everything we can to address that. Kentucky currently ranks in the bottom 10 states for child well-being in this country. Physical activity reduces stress and anxiety. Active kids take fewer drugs and smoke less often. Regular physical activity increases your lifespan by 7 years. More active kids perform better in reading, writing, and math. I believe that the guidelines we've created will allow everyone to enjoy our parks all the time.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Ms. Nicely?
I will also be voting yes as well, and piggybacking off of what Ms. Kyle said and Ms. Lucas, Jasper Lucas. Yes, I believe we do need our kids to enjoy the parks, and I also think that the city would be controlling who would be on that park at that time as far as organized sports and running. And again, I think this has been going on way too long, over almost a year now, and these kids actually did nothing wrong. It was just like an accident, I guess, from overlapping events that this was brought to light. So it sounds like they were very well-behaved children, and we don't want to discourage our kids from using the parks, or any adults for that matter. And we are the Friendship City, so I will be voting yes as well. Thank you.
Okay, any other discussion? Okay, Mrs. Hoffman?
Mr. Skidmore?
Yes.
Mr. Hermes?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Cahill?
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Skidmore? Yes, ma'am. Ms. Kyle?
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Jasper Lucas?
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Wilson?
Yes.
Ms. Nicely?
Yes, ma'am.
And Ms. Reckers?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, motion carried. Do I entertain a motion that we adjourn? Ms. Reckers, Ms. Kyle, any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. See you at 7. right, we'll go ahead and open up the City Council caucus meeting for June 18th, or July 18th. Whoa. All right, only item on the agenda for this evening for discussion is the revised Gary Meyer Emergency Fund. This was discussed by Councilman Tyson Hermes and Councilwoman Rebecca Reckers. Who would want to open that discussion?
I think people have probably heard enough from me over the last 10 months, so I think it'd be better if you talked about it.
Cool. First thing we've agreed on today. All right. So I compiled quite a few notes and sent them to you guys. I researched some other cities and state systems that have similar programs in place. So I compiled a couple of ideas for triggering and repayment examples, action that would be needed by us in discussion, and then some of the financial and accounting requirements. So I've listed the objective as an initiative to safeguard the assets of the community through establishing like a resilience or a stability fund. City Council wishes to mitigate fiscal volatility and provide assurances to the community that the city can experience a negative downturn in the economy or an unforeseen disaster, which could disrupt the delivery of services and negatively impact our operating budget at any given time within the fiscal year. And by establishing this fund, we'll have that fund in place, or I'm not sure if fund is the correct word to use. I'll yield to Ms. Kramer here shortly. So what I'd like to do is align on those triggering requirements and formal withdrawal rules that we want to establish in this legislation, as well as stipulating conditions for repayment. I looked at quite a few cities, some in other states. Cincinnati has one. Theirs is based on X amount of revenue, whereas if we're establishing this as a pool of 5 million even versus a variable amount based on revenues. Some of the examples here, a declaration of economic emergency or other specific circumstances that would slow the economic growth, a natural disaster, including flood, tornado, et cetera. I know we've talked at length about that one as an option. Some cities that I reviewed had anything with regard to a natural disaster or emergency, having a 2-year repayment, so that the city would have 2 years to replenish those funds, whereas an economic growth economic downturn would be like a 12-month repayment. So we can discuss that. Let's see here. Unexpected revenue declines as an option. So whether we call it a resilience fund or a stabilization fund, some cities have it to where the funds can't be used to operating or regular capital expenditures that would otherwise be funded through our reserves. So we have that established requirement by statute with our city. This, again, is in addition to that. And I like that stipulation that it would exclude things that would be covered otherwise. And any proposed appropriation of money would, from the fund, would be submitted with a plan by the city to restore the fund balance within whichever, whether it's 12 months or 24 based on those factors. And lastly, access to those funds, whether we decide by a majority or supermajority of a vote of the governing body to make the transfer, the funds to the general fund from the recovery fund for whichever stipulations that we establish. So again, I know that's a lot to review, but these are just those examples that I identified. So based on our prior conversations, I feel like that really aligns by having both an economic downturn as an option as well as situations involving natural disaster, flood, tornado. I mean, I can yield the floor to, oh, and we also, again, need to know those financial and accounting requirements. So I've listed here that I would like to, Kara to speak on where it would be best placed, as well as if any feedback would be required from our auditors, so that we can properly draft the legislation to align with the respective location in the budget for it to live. So I'll stop talking now.
Do you have specific questions directed to Ms. Kramer, or?
I mean, sure. We need, for drafting the legislation, we need to know where it would be best placed. So if you had any feedback on that, or if you want to do research, I know this went out Friday, we're all ears as, for taking.
I have a question. So when you're asking that, are you saying on the general side of things, or are you talking about on the capital side of things? Is that, or what type of fund within capital? Or are you just asking a general question?
So I'm not sure, based on, again, I looked at quite a few cities, not many of them had these funds actually in the capital fund. And I know we put that there when we established we made that decision last year to move the money. But I'm not sure if that's the most appropriate place for a recovery fund or a resilience fund.
Okay.
If it should be in the general fund under a different designation, I'm not the accounting or finance, well, I'm a finance SME, but on the topic of city government, I think that Kara would be most appropriate to opine on that.
So currently, for the fiscal year 24 budget, our current plan, we have a committed fund balance, and this is on the notes of the financials. I know nobody really likes to read these, but we do have a policy that council has approved. So I did make copies for everybody, and you can all see that. So for the fiscal year 24 balance, for our target balance, we passed $5.9 million in emergencies, and that sits currently now in the general fund. Last year in fiscal year 22, well, I guess I should say 2 years ago, because we're now in fiscal year 24, but in fiscal year 23, we did transfer the $5 million over of the Gary Meyer. Now, depending on the intent of where you want it to sit, it probably would be more appropriate to sit it in the general fund, and we can put parameters around that. But again, I think that's for more discussion, for a more intimate discussion that we can get together, maybe in the budget ad hoc committee, and I can put together an ordinance, and we can draft something and make sure that council is aligned with that based on the intent, based on your discussion points and also Tyson's.
So we'll have that as a takeaway to realign on where it should sit based on those factors. With regard to the purpose, does anyone have any comments or questions about those two, economic recovery or economic downturn, as well as declaration of emergency natural disasters being the criteria for this fund?
Yes, so one question we need to know is, how is this Gary Meyer different from the current that we currently have, the 30% appropriations? Is this something new, or is this still the 30% that we currently have?
The 30% is already made up of $5.9 million.
Yeah, so
It sits in the
GFOA,
general fund.
GFOA's recommendation is to have 3 to 6 months of expenditures in a reserve. We currently have the 5.9, which is a little over 4 months. And then we also have the additional 5 million sitting in the capital.
That 5 million is this 5 million that we're discussing, correct?
No, it's separate.
So
There's two, yes.
the other cities that have these funds have it to not be used for operating or capital expenditures that would otherwise be funded by operating revenues and reserves. So it would be in addition to that.
But the 30% reserve for emergencies that sits in the operating budget is also not incorporated into the operations of the organization for that fiscal year. It's separate.
So this would be more of a fixed figure versus a variable amount that would be based on
Yeah, so currently it says 30% of appropriations, where appropriations is the budget. So on the audit, we actually put 30% of the budgeted amount. So yeah, we need to define if we want to change the 30% or if we now want to do a fixed amount.
So I think what she's saying is basically, so we currently do 30%. That could be amended, that ordinance could be amended to maybe change it to a different amount and take care of this money that way. That is an option that we could do.
So my question to you is this 30% that's required by statute, is it a fixed amount? Like, so I guess my question is, if we're adding 5 million to that, then that number could seemingly reduce, correct? Because the statute only requires the 30%.
Well, it's not statute, it's just city ordinance. Yeah, it's a KLC recommendation that for all cities, they have 30% of their appropriations put into an emergency reserve fund. So many, many years ago, the council decided to enact that, and it is part of our operating budget. So that 30%, it's a variable amount. So it's all dependent on our appropriations. And it's restricted to emergencies. Now, I can understand if you wanted to maybe give that more of a definition and use this stabilization fund concept to create like what actually constitutes as an emergency, because we've never utilized those funds. However, we do have that 30% sitting there, which is about 5.9 million. And that's aside from this other 5 million, and it's aside from the 2+ million that we have in unreserved. Ms. Jasper Lucas?
So it's my understanding that we have $5 million that some are calling the Gary Meyer Emergency Fund. I'm not going to call it that because I think it's an insult to Gary Meyer. But we have this $5 million, not the 30%. We have a separate bucket of $5 million.
That's correct.
My understanding was that this was where that $5 million was going to move to.
Well, I guess the question that we have is what this is defining is something that we already have.
I think what council is saying is we want more.
Okay, so that's fine. That'll be,
I mean, that's
it'll probably be like closer to like 60% of your appropriation.
I think that, council voted to set the money aside, and now we're being asked for a trigger for when that would be spent. And that's what I understood Ms. Reckers was developing here, was that those parameters for when would we spend that money. I completely understand that we already have 30% set aside. That's great. We need to leave it there. I also want 5 million put in a resilience fund.
I have a question. So we currently do a 30%. And then we have this other $5 million. Could it be, and the 30% varies from year to year. So could it be written to where it's 30% plus 5 million? So the 30% still is a variable amount based on appropriations with a $5 million always adder. Is that something that it would?
Mr. Glenn, I understand that the way I'm hearing this is that there is the 30% that's being held aside, the $5.9 million, and that's based on the total budget, and it's based on total appropriations. But that money could be used for anything in the case of an emergency. The $5 million that we're calling the Gary Meyer Emergency Fund, not officially, that can only be used for capital. So I don't think it makes sense to combine these.
Well, I mean, but I think that's tonight's discussion is, do we want to keep it as capital?
It could be a capital purchase. Could be vehicles, it could be a fleet of cruisers, it
Well,
could,
so can the 5.9.
but there's these triggering.
Your mic's not on, sorry.
There are triggering stipulations, whereas the reserves can be used arguably at any time. Whereas
In the event of emergency.
in the event of an emergency, whereas this would have 2 or 3 triggering elements and a requirement to be repaid.
Yeah, so that's why I think we're agreeing. Mr. Glenn is saying that we combine all this together and just make a larger percentage that we allocate for emergencies. But I'm saying this is separate. It's not, this is different than the 5.9 million.
It is different than the 5.9 million.
Yeah.
Are we speaking about the interest that's being drawn on this money?
Yes, we are receiving interest on our money. It all sits in one account, and we're getting interest on it, and it goes to the general fund.
Is it possible to separate the interest into a different account so that the 5 million would not be touched?
I mean, we can do that. But I feel like we're making it more confusing than it needs to be.
Well, isn't the issue that the concern is the 5 million and how it's going to be utilized and not to touch it?
Yes.
We're unsure, so I think that's what tonight's discussions are, as far as touching it, not touching it, and if we are going to appropriate it, what kind of things do we want to spend it on? So I think that's my takeaway from it. So we're just unsure, so we're talking about $5 million. I think the first question is are we open to whether that extra $5 million stays on the capital side, or can it be on the general side? So that would be our first direction, need for direction. So if it stays on the capital side, then we would try to figure out how best to craft something that would be appropriate for how we want to keep it, spend it, or do whatever. And if it comes over to the general side, doing the same for that. So I think the first question is I think from my standpoint, and I'm certainly no expert, just needing to know what council's desire is, general, capital, or do we really have a concern? Yeah, Tom.
I think, to answer that question, we need to figure out what the triggers are, because right now, reading this, it's an emergency. We make the decision. We use this committed fund balance, correct?
Yes.
So with this, we're looking at triggers for this. What is the triggers? So that's what we're trying to figure out tonight is kind of like what you want is what the triggers are.
Yep.
And I like the fact that there's triggers that will be built into this for the resiliency fund. Right now, the committed fund is I can get 7 of my friends to vote that we want to take care of this right now. But with the resiliency fund, there has to be a trigger, and then that trigger also takes the council and says, we need to approve this. So that's the ask tonight. I think this discussion that Ms. Reckers brought up puts that kind of out there, and we still have work to do on this.
Yeah.
So that work to do is to figure out what those triggers are.
Right.
So, and bringing this committed fund balance, that's a great idea. Appreciate that. But once again, that's council can make that decision.
Right.
With that money. With this, we're trying to say, hey, we want something that says this needs to be used. It needs to be used now, and and then the money needs to go back eventually.
Yes.
If it's in capital, that means we can only use it on capital projects, which is why I think it needs to be in the general. What we call, whether it's a line item or a fund or whatever, I think that's Kara's call as far as how we account for that within the general fund. But my preference would be to put it in the general because I feel like we have a lot more freedom with it that way.
I think we agree with that as well. Yeah, Vicki.
I'm sorry, because I missed the last meetings, but is it my understanding that we have 5.9 million in the reserve funds in the general, right?
That is correct.
And then we have 5 million that we want to decide what to do with. There's no other money for anything that, you know, if the economy turns down or whatever. That's what we've got, right?
There's an additional unreserved, unrestricted amount of over 2 million as well.
Okay, so we have the other 2 million. All right.
And then that's unaudited numbers. So that, all the numbers that we're discussing right now are not incorporating all the expenditures that we didn't
Yeah, I understand
use and the additional revenues that we took in. So there was a surplus, there was a bigger carry forward balance that once it's audited, those numbers will be higher.
Okay. And then the 5.9 million, that would take us through 4 months?
Correct. 4.5.
4.5?
4.5 months
See, I
of
don't like that.
reserves.
I like to have more cushion there. Okay, thank you. I just needed to clarify that for my own.
Well, there would have been more cushion, but we transferred 5 million to the over. So previously, we did have more, yes.
Jennifer.
I was just going to say, if we have such a surplus, we can add 2 million to the 5.
Yeah, we won't have final numbers for you from fiscal year '23 until probably around September when the auditors come, but December is when the auditors will report on fiscal year '23.
I wasn't being serious. I'm just saying.
you're joking?
Since we have so much.
Well,
let's
that's
not
going
put
to
the
start
cart.
the conversation of tax rate decrease.
Let's not put the cart before the horse. Let's wait till we have actual numbers before we start spending the money.
Let's figure out how to eliminate a whole tax. All right. Do we have anything else? Any other discussion? Ms. Reckers?
So are we fairly aligned on these triggers? That where if it's an economic, or excuse me, if it's a declaration of emergency, natural disaster, there would be a 2-year repayment. If it were an economic downturn, it would be 1 year. If I were to work with Jack to draft something like that into legislation to review, does that sound fair? Okay, thank you.
Do you think we could do like a range? Instead of making it a set figure? I mean, I'm only saying this, that if there was an economic downturn, sometimes things don't spring back in the course of a year or two, and it may be harder to repay that. So if we set a range that we said that we want to keep this, whatever it might be, in the 3 to 5 million, no less than 3 million, no more than 5 million, and the repayment to at least get up to a minimum point. And as the economy gets better, that we're able to fill that completely, then I think would be a good approach if we're going to do it that way.
If we weren't the government, it would be less complicated, right?
Okay, so my recommendation would be, as you're drafting this ordinance, if you could just kind of meet with Kara and myself, just to kind of, before we take it to Jack, just to kind of get her input and everything. I think that would go a long way with, how she sees things.
Mr. Hermes?
Thank you, Mayor. I do have one other quick clarification. I mean, and I think I understand this, but I just want to make sure I do. This is pretty different from the ordinance that was passed. This is to replace it, correct? Not in addition to the, and I keep saying Gary Meyer Fund just because we all know what that is. This is kind of replacing that, not in addition to it, correct? Just to clarify.
Do we have 10 million? I'm just kidding. Yeah, this is taking, so we originally put it in capital because that's where we thought we wanted it to be. And once we further discussed over the last 10 months, a myriad of reasons why we would want to tap this, and looking and doing research and, working with Kara, really narrowed it down to this is probably better suited in the general fund instead of capital, as more of a permanent place for it. And this is establishing those triggering elements and repayment criteria in conjunction with that. So it'll be a very thoughtful and measured plan.
Sounds great.
I feel a lot more comfortable with this being in the general fund because it doesn't, right now, we have changed how we utilize the capital fund. And it's always been exactly the same way of utilizing that fund. So this kind of reverts it back to the traditional way of how we've been handling the capital asset fund and only transferring money into the capital asset fund as the appropriations require. So, great job. Ms. Kyle?
Yeah, I also want to commend Ms. Reckers because I feel more comfortable having the triggers. I was a little bit uncomfortable with just saying natural disaster or emergency because something else may come up and we got the money if it's something that, needs to be done. And I don't know how you word that other than what she came up with. It sounds a lot better to me. So I think this is a great way to do that. And I appreciate all the extra work that people put in.
Brilliant. All right. Any other discussion? Motion to adjourn. Ms. Reckers? Ms. Nicely? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. Have a good evening.